During the so-called papal pornocracy of the early 10th century, popes were being manipulated, exploited, and maneuvered for nefarious ends by mistresses who used them as pawns in their own power games. With some justification, this era was also called the rule of the harlots. How to find a missing pope. So many popes were assassinated, mutilated, poisoned, or otherwise done away with that, when one of them disappeared, never to be seen again, it was only natural to scan a list of violent explanations to find out what had happened to him. Death by strangulation in prison was a frequent cause. Had the vanished pope been hideously mutilated and therefore made unfit to appear in public? Had he made off with the papal cash box? Or should the brothels and other houses of ill repute be searched to find out if he was there? Often, there was no clear answer and explanations were left to gossip and rumor. One thing was certain, though: by the 9th century, the papacy and the popes were the playthings of noble families like the Spoletans, who controlled cities such as Venice, Milan, Genoa, Pisa, Florence, and Siena, among others. Through their wealth and influence and their connections with armed militias, these families formed what amounted to a feudal aristocracy. They were generally a brutish lot, willing to bring the utmost violence and cruelty to the task of seizing and controlling the most prestigious office in the Christian world. Once achieved, though, their newfound power could be ephemeral, for the reigns of some of their protégés were very short indeed. There were, for example, 24 popes between 872 CE and 904 CE. The longest reign lasted a decade, and another 4 came and went within a year. There were 9 popes in the 9 years between 896 CE and 904 CE, as many pontiffs as were elected during the entire 20th century. This meant, of course, that the papacy of Rome was in a constant state of uproar as the struggle for the Vatican had to be fought over and over again. The deadly Duchess, Stephen VII, was one of the short-lived popes, promising the House of Spoleto in central Italy a taste of papal power that turned out to be a brief 15 months in 896 CE and 897 CE. Stephen was almost certainly insane, and his affliction appears to have been common knowledge in Rome. This, though, did not deter the Duchess Agiltrude from foisting him onto the throne of St. Peter. In July 896 CE, Agiltrude, it appears, had a special task for Pope Stephen, which involved wreaking revenge on her one-time enemy, the late Pope Formosus. Like most, if not all, legendary glamour heroines of history, Agiltrude was reputed to be very beautiful, with a sexy figure and long blonde hair. However that may be, she was certainly a formidable woman with a fearsome taste for retribution. In 894 CE, Agiltrude took her young son, Lambert, to Rome to be confirmed by Pope Formosus as Holy Roman Emperor, or so she expected. She found, though, that the venerable Formosus had ideas of his own. He preferred another claimant, Arnulf of Carinthia, a descendant of Charlemagne, the first of the Holy Roman Emperors. The Pope realized that Agiltrude was not going to stand by quietly and watch as her son was displaced, and knowing well the turbulent temper of the Spoletans, he saw trouble coming. So Formosus appealed to Arnulf for help. Arnulf, for his part, had no intention of being forced to give way to an underage upstart like Lambert or his implacable mother. He soon arrived with his army, sent Agiltrude packing back to Spoleto, and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Formosus on 22nd February 896 CE. The new emperor at once set out to pursue Agiltrude, but before he could reach Spoleto, he suffered a paralyzing illness, possibly a stroke. Pope Formosus died 6 weeks later on the 4th of April 896 CE, reputedly poisoned by Agiltrude. By all accounts, he had been an admirable pope, well known for his care for the poor, his austere way of life, his chastity and devotion to prayer, all of them admirable Christian virtues, and remarkable in an age of decadence, self-seeking, and barbarism. But whatever his virtues, Formosus could not entirely escape the poisonous atmosphere of violence and intrigue that permeated the church in his time. It was all too easy to make enemies and so become exposed to their vengeance and bile. It was also possible that Formosus was too honest and outspoken for his own good. It was, for instance, an unwise move to oppose the election of Pope John VIII in 872 CE, particularly when Formosus himself had been among the candidates. It was bad policy, too, to have friends among Pope John's enemies who were perennially plotting against him. They were so intent on destroying him that they sought help for their nefarious plans from the Muslim Saracens, who were the sworn enemies of Christianity. This was an age when the enemies of popes had a habit of disappearing or ending up dead. The writing on the wall was easy to read, and when his plotter friends fled from the papal court, Formosus fled with them. This, of course, implied that he was one of the conspirators. As a result, he was charged with some lurid crimes, such as despoiling the cloisters in Rome and conspiring to destroy the papal see. Formosus was punished accordingly. In 878 CE, he was excommunicated. This sentence was withdrawn, though, when Formosus agreed to sign a declaration stating that he would never return to Rome or perform priestly duties. In addition, the Diocese of Porto in Portugal, where Formosus had been made cardinal bishop in 864 CE, was taken from him. All was forgiven for a while. Such accusations and penalties made against an elderly man of proven probity and morality were clearly ludicrous and had all the appearance of a put-up job. Fortunately, all was later forgiven. After the death of John VIII in 882 CE, his successor as Pope, Marinus recalled Formosus to Rome from his refuge in western France and restored him to his diocese of Porto. 9 years later, Formosus was himself elected pope, and it was during his 5-year tenure that he made a very serious mistake. He crossed Duchess Agiltrude and the House of Spoleto. He also made other enemies over his policies as pope, which included trying to eradicate the influence of lay, non-ordained people in church affairs. Quite possibly, this was why the death of one of her enemies and the incapacity of the other were not enough for Agiltrude. She had in mind something much more dramatic and gruesome. Once Formosus's successor as Pope, Boniface VI, had gone, the way was clear for Stephen VII, the candidate favored by Agiltrude and her equally malicious son Lambert, to step up to the plate and do their bidding. The dark workings of hatred. In January 897 CE, Stephen announced that a trial was to take place at the Church of St. John Lateran, the official church of the Pope as Bishop of Rome. The defendant was Pope Formosus, now deceased for 9 months, for whom Stephen had developed a fanatical hatred. Stephen was a thoroughly nasty piece of work, but the source of his hatred is not precisely known. It is possible that just being a member of the House of Spoleto, relentlessly prodded along by the fearsome Agiltrude, was enough. Even so, hatred, however obsessive, could not easily explain the horrors that featured in the posthumous trial of Pope Formosus, sometime in January 897, then 9 months dead. The dead pope was not tried in his absence. At Agiltrude's prompting, Formosus, or rather his rotting corpse, which was barely held together by his penitential hair shirt, was removed from his burial place and dressed in papal vestments. He was then carried into the court, where he was propped up on a throne. Stephen sat nearby, presiding over the trial, alongside co-judges chosen from the clergy. To ensure they were unfit for the task and merely did what they were told, several co-judges had been bullied and terrorized and sat out the proceedings in a lather of fear. At the trial, the charges laid against Formosus by Pope John VIII were revived. For good measure, Stephen added fresh accusations designed to prove that Formosus had been unfit for the pontificate. He had committed committed perjury, Stephen claimed, coveted the throne of St. Peter, and violated church law. Drama at the Cadaver Synod. Stephen's behavior in court was extraordinary. The clergy and other spectators in court were treated to frenzied tirades as Stephen mocked the dead pope and launched gross insults at him. Formosus had been allowed a form of defense in the form of an 18-year-old deacon. The unfortunate young man was supposed to answer for Formosus, but was too frightened of the raving, screaming Stephen to make much of an impression. Weak, mumbling answers were the most the poor lad could manage. Inevitably, at the end of the proceedings, which came to be called appropriately the Cadaver Synod, Formosus was found guilty on all the charges against him. Punishment followed immediately. Stephen declared that all of the dead pope's acts and ordinations were null and void. At Stephen's command, his corpse was stripped of its vestments and dressed instead in the clothes of an ordinary layman. The 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand, which he had used to make papal blessings, were cut off. The severed fingers, or rather what was left of them after 9 months of decay, were handed over the Agiltrude, who had watched the proceedings with open satisfaction. Finally, Pope Stephen ordered that Formosus should be reburied in a common grave. This was done, but there was a grisly sequel. Formosus's corpse was soon dug up, dragged through the streets of Rome, tied with weights, and thrown into the river Tiber. Formosus had been revered by many of the clergy, and he was popular with the Romans, and before his election in 891 CE, many had rioted at the prospect of another pope being chosen instead. There was, therefore, no shortage of helpers when a monk who had remained faithful to the dead pope's memory asked a group of fishermen to aid him in retrieving Formosus's much misused remains. Afterwards, Formosus was buried yet again, this time in an ordinary graveyard. Like the rescue itself, the burial had to be kept secret. If Formosus's enemies, particularly Pope Stephen and Agiltrude, had learnt of it, it was likely that the body of the dead pope would have been desecrated yet again. The Cadaver Synod, known more graphically by its Latin name Synodus Horrenda, prompted uproar and outrage throughout Rome. This was underlined in the superstitious popular mind when the Basilica of St. John suddenly fell down with a thunderous roar, just as Pope Stephen and Agiltrude emerged from the Church of St. John Lateran at the end of the trial. The fact that the Basilica had long ago been condemned as unsafe was less convincing than the idea that the collapse was a sign of God's displeasure. Before long, in much the same vein, rumors arose that the corpse of Pope Formosus had performed miracles, an ability normally ascribed only to saints. The widespread disgust at the savagery of the proceedings and its ghastly sequel convinced many clergy that if anyone was unfit to be pope, it was Stephen VII. An element of self-interest also featured in the wave of hostility aroused by the synod. Many clergy who had been ordained by Formosus were deprived of their positions when Stephen nullified the dead pope's ordinations. Pope Stephen meets his maker. Hostility soon translated into action. In August 897 CE, 8 months after the Cadaver Synod, a palace revolution took place, and Stephen VII was deposed. Stripped of his splendid papal vestments and insignia, he was thrown into prison, where he was strangled. This, though, was by no means the end of the days when the popes and the papacy were mired in disgrace. For one thing, Agiltrude was still around and active, and wherever she was, there was bound to be trouble. Agiltrude was enraged at the murder of her protege Pope Stephen and moved in fast to restore the influence that had been killed off with him. But she had no luck with the new pope, Romanus, who was placed on the papal throne in 897 CE, but remained there for only 3 months. Romanus, it appears, fell foul of one of the factions at the papal court that was opposed to Agiltrude and the House of Spoleto. Afterwards, the hapless former pope was made a monk, an early medieval European euphemism that meant he had been deposed. Restoring Formosus. Romanus's successor, Pope Theodore II, was even less fortunate, but at least he lasted long enough to do right by the much-abused Formosus. Theodore ordered the body of the late pope reburied, clad in pontifical vestments and with full honors in St. Peter's in Rome. He also annulled the court where the cadaver synod had taken place and invalidated its verdicts and decisions. Much to the relief of the clergy dispossessed by Stephen VII, Theodore declared valid once again the offices they had once received from Formosus. It was as if the cadaver synod and the lunatic Pope Stephen had never existed. Unfortunately, however, it brought Theodore few, if any, rewards. His reign lasted only 20 days, in November 897 CE, after which he mysteriously died. The following year, however, future trials of dead persons were prohibited by Theodore's successor, Pope John IX. 10 years later, Sergius III, who was elected pope in 904 CE, dug up Pope Formosus and put him on trial all over again. Sergius, then a cardinal, had been a co-judge at the Cadaver Synod in 897 CE and became infuriated when the guilty verdict was overturned. This time, Sergius restored the guilty judgment and added some ghoulish touches of his own. He had Formosus's corpse beheaded and cut off 3 more of his fingers before consigning him to the river Tiber once more. To emphasize his message, Sergius ordered a flattering epitaph for Stephen VII be inscribed on his tomb. Not long afterwards, Formosus's headless corpse surfaced again when it became entangled in a fisherman's net. Retrieved from the Tiber for a second time, Formosus was returned once more to St. Peter's Church. Sergius had, of course, contravened the prohibition on posthumous trials declared by John IX, so his actions were essentially invalid. Nevertheless, a public statement of Formosus's innocence had to be made, and both he and his work were formally reinstated yet again. When the chief instigator of the original Cadaver Synod, Agiltrude, was still alive when Formosus was exonerated for a second time, but her position and her power had radically altered because, through the extraordinary antics of Stephen VII, she had triumphed over the dead pope in 896 CE, but she had a weakness. Agiltrude's power, while considerable, was essentially second-hand, relying on puppets like Pope Stephen who could be maneuvered into the positions she wanted them to occupy, and from there implement her policies. Also important in Agiltrude's armory were certain family relationships that gave her the high status she enjoyed from the positions occupied by her husband, Guy of Spoleto, and after him by their son, Lambert. When Guy died on December 12, 894 CE, Agiltrude instantly lost her standing as Duchess of Spoleto and Camerino, Queen of Italy, and Holy Roman Empress. There was still some kudos to be had from Lambert's elevation to all these titles, but he died before his mother in 898 CE, and Agiltrude's last family link with power disappeared. Agiltrude died in 923 CE, but by that time, 2 other women had discovered another way into the corridors of papal power in Rome. They were Theodora and her daughter Marozia, both of them the mistresses of popes. Theodora was described as a shameless strumpet, and her two daughters, Marozia and the younger Theodora, as possessing reputations not much better than their mother. Neither the elder Theodora nor Marozia halted the rapid turnover that had become a regular feature of the papacy. If anything, they exacerbated it. In the first years of the 10th century, short pontificates of a year or less persisted, and so did the violent deaths of popes that reflected the ongoing struggle for power. Others managed to survive for a year or two, but rarely much more. In fact, popes succeeded one another with such rapidity that papal servants made a handsome profit selling off their personal accoutrements and furnishings,